We are live. Hi, it's Allison Gill with the breakdown, Mueller, She Wrote, Daily Beans, Clean Up on Aisle 45, the Unjustified podcast. Welcome to everybody. I'm so excited, especially right this minute, to be talking with Adam Klasfeld, good friend. He's been on the pod a million times, going all the way back to the kitchen table days of Mueller, She Wrote. And he's now launched a great new Substack and platform called All Rise News. And boy, I've been following All Rise News on Blue Sky like crazy, because your coverage is just so in depth, and you're so good at explaining things in a way that a non-lawyer like myself can understand. So we really appreciate you, and I'm glad to have you here because some breaking news from All Rise News just happened.
Thank you so much, Allison. Yeah, huge news. It's the first shot across the bow in the cases involving big law, the first ruling by Judge Howell permanently blocking Trump's executive order against Perkins Coie. And we saw, the flood of TROs and all of the judges really up in arms, knowing what a real threat to the rule of law this is. And, this happened minutes before we were going live, and we long planned to go live. It's a sort of gift from Judge Howell here. So if
Yes,
folks
thank you,
don't
Judge
mind,
Howell.
I think I'm just going to read her opinion because this is one for the ages. It starts, no American president has ever before issued executive orders like this, the one at issue in this lawsuit, targeting a prominent law firm with adverse actions to be executed by all executive branch agencies. But in purpose and effect, this draws from a playbook as old as Shakespeare, who penned the phrase, the first thing we do, let's kill all the lawyers. When Shakespeare's character, a rebel leader intent on becoming king, hears this suggestion, he promptly incorporates this tactic as part of his plan to assume power, leading in the same scene to the rebel leader demanding, away with him, referring to an educated clerk who can make obligations and write court hand. Eliminating lawyers as the guardians of the rule of law removes a major impediment to the path to more power. That's how it begins.
Man.
This is a judge who is talking about the serious threat to the rule of law, and let's not forget that Judge Howell knows all about that. In terms of Donald Trump, she's the one who presided over the grand juries in the criminal cases when she was chief judge of the District of DC. And I think we can fully expect decisions like that following suit in the same court. At All Rise News, we recently covered one in the Jenner case by a different judge, and this was a judge appointed by George W. Bush. I was listening in on that hearing. They have some remote coverage of the courts in the District of DC, giving the public more of a chance to engage with these cases. And the pull quote that I came out of that hearing with was this judge saying, give me a break. This was U.S. District Judge John Bates summarizing the Trump administration's argument, trying to defend that. That was all that he could say to that. Give me a break. That it was such a frivolous argument. What in particular the Trump administration judge was trying to say that because the law firm embraces diversity initiatives, that somehow justifies keeping the lawyers, all of the lawyers and employees away from government buildings. That's what got the judge so dismissive, because it was a very dismissive making argument. It was a ridiculous argument. So I think we can fully expect uh, rulings like this. And I want to make just one important point here. This ruling that just came down from Judge Howell blocks the entire executive order in its entirety. Before today, before now, the temporary restraining orders didn't go that far. They blocked sections of the order because it's hard when you're giving temporary relief. There's some things where a US president has broad power, like security clearances. And so on a TRO, none of the judges felt it was within their power to do this. This one, it's as if this order never existed. And that is one of the things that the lawyers were saying here. And this was a very powerful quote in the Jenner and Block hearing that I was listening to earlier, uh, that one of the lawyers was saying that don't make it that the only way to escape the entirety of this order was, in his words, on bended knee, like the Paul Weisses of the legal community who had entered into settlement agreements. So this is a major development in this whole litigation. And it happened just minutes before we had long planned to speak tonight.
Yeah, very serendipitous and quite a strong ruling. I think it's interesting that she said it. I thought that was kind of a little extra, turn of phrase there that she added herself. And I think it's going to be interesting to see with these, law firms, because we've got a handful of law firms that are pushing back and a handful of law firms that have caved and given $40 to $140 million in pro bono work. And in Pam Bondi's latest, um, I don't know, proclamation about the police state, she is now offering these lawyers up for use by local and state law enforcement to defend them in cases of excessive force or whatever. And it'll be very interesting to see, based on this ruling and where it goes on appeal and likely up to the Supreme Court, whether these law firms that have bent the knee and offered pro bono work will rescind it maybe at some point, depending on what this court or higher courts do. That doesn't make them braver in my eyes. I'm
Mm.
still, firmly behind law firms like Perkins Coie as opposed to law firms like Paul Weiss. But it'll be interesting to see how these law firms, when they are asked to provide their pro bono services to probably unlawful things, or at least highly skeptical, awful but lawful things, how they respond to that call given this ruling or future rulings. I'm not sure if once it gets up to the Supreme Court, maybe parts and pieces of the executive order can be reinstated, like the withdrawing of security clearances, for example, because he's got a broad power to do that. And this Supreme Court and him are pals, even though John Roberts seems completely flabbergasted as to why he's acting like a king when he's the one who handed him the crown. But it'll be interesting to see how these law firms that have subjugated themselves react to this particular ruling and future rulings.
Right, right. And because this live happens minutes after the ruling came out, I should say I have not read this 102-page ruling. That is the length of this ruling. This is a judge who is taking her time on an appeal and making sure that as you noted, Allison, this is going up. And she is clearly in taking that intro, starting off with Shakespeare and then moving forward. She's writing this one for the ages.
Yeah, and I'm glad she is. And you're right in that she knows a lot more than we do about what has
Mhm.
happened in past Trump cases and Trump allied cases, because she was the chief judge there in the DC circuit, or in the DC District Court. Let's talk about some more things that All Rise is reporting, because I've been following you closely, and we've also been doing this over on Unjustified. These kinds of bench slaps, these kinds of very forceful rulings have been happening a lot to Trump's Department of Justice. And
Right.
one of my favorites recently is a Fourth Circuit opinion by Judge Wilkinson. And I know that y'all read that and covered that. I wrote about it here on my Substack on the breakdown. Talk a little bit about just in general. We've been seeing a lot of judges like it. Not only do I have whiplash from what happened last November, just with politics in general, but with having to adjust now to the government being the one that's getting yelled at and castigated and bench slapped versus the defendants namely Trump, who switched places kind of quickly. And a
Right.
lot of judges are really coming out forcefully against this administration. Whether those orders hold is another thing entirely. But as Ketanji Brown Jackson said in Puerto Rico this weekend, it's important that the judges stand strong and that history will favor them.
Right. And I think that they understand what kind of historical moment we're in. I keep harkening back to when I was covering the post 2020 election litigation that was happening at one court after another. And when judges realize there's something serious that's happening, a threat to the rule of law, a threat to the constitutional order, you see opinions like this one after another. And yes, you're starting to see opinions like this with the Wilkinson opinion, Ronald Reagan appointee who's speaking directly to the Trump administration, speaking directly to people in the White House, trying to essentially get them off the ledge, saying that you might succeed in trying to discredit the judiciary among your supporters in the public eye, but this is something that's going to boomerang against you because, as he put it, the perception of lawlessness is going to infect, it's going to be a contagion that's going to have law in its epitaph. And so I encourage everyone to read that ruling. Sometimes these decisions just speak to history. There was one earlier this week that we flagged in the case of one of the Columbia students who was targeted for his activism, another green card holder, not Mahmoud Khalil. And it was a case in Vermont where the judge said, likened it to the Red Scare and talked about other times in our history where there was a moral panic or an anti-communist or an anti-anarchist witch hunt. And he took that broad historical view, didn't go as far back as Shakespeare, but did go back more than a century to the Palmer raids in the early 20th century and talking about the moral panics of our time and how this anti-First Amendment crackdown is and it harkens to that, and how he said in his view that the fever will eventually pass. That he had a pretty hopeful note, that particular judge. But it's, I'm covering this beat for a couple decades. You see opinions like this once in a while. Judges are writing them one after another because I think they understand the danger. They understand why they had an ambition to become a federal judge and because they wanted to uphold the law and see the lawlessness surrounding them. And by the way, there were 4 federal judges who described what's going on as lawlessness, an entire panel of the Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals and Judge Zinis in the district court below in the Kilmar Abrego Garcia case. So you're seeing judges thinking very deeply on this, not only within the confines of these cases, but the lawlessness that these cases represent.
Yeah, and I'm also thinking of, I think last week on Unjustified, Andy and I talked, Andy McCabe, who's my co-host on that show, talked about Judge Lamberth's ruling in Voices of America and how he was like, you didn't even give me an even if scenario here. Normally, if you're going to make an argument on the law, you're like, well, we don't think this applies because of this. And even if you think it applies, Judge, we don't think it does because of this. And even if you think those 2 things were wrong on, here's a third thing. And the judge was like, you didn't even give me a second option. And you didn't even mention arbitrary and capricious anywhere in your thing. Your reasoning is completely void. It's like, I award you 0 points. May God have mercy on your soul. And and now we notice in Trump's reply to the ACLU's case about the Alien Enemies Act now in Boasberg's court, Trump's opposition came into that motion, amended complaint and motion for preliminary injunction. And now he's maybe they've learned a lesson because now they've said, well, there's no agreement with Bukele. But even if there was, it's not a valid agreement. And even if all that you think it's a valid agreement, I, the president, I get to decide what the definitions of words in laws mean. And in the Alien Enemies Act case, I say that Tren de Aragua is an incursion or an invasion into the United States by a foreign government. And the judge, down in the Southern District of Texas in a different case about the Alien Enemies Act, ripped him apart for that argument as
Mm,
well, and entered, I think, a permanent injunction uh,
right.
for those folks down in the Southern District of Texas in their habeas petition. So it's going around. These judges are tired, and a lot of them are Trump-appointed judges, like the Fernando Rodriguez, I think, in the Southern District of Texas, a Trump
Right, right,
appointee,
right.
a
That was
Trump
a Trump
appointee.
appointee. Absolutely. And Fernando Rodriguez, he did he went down the definition of the Alien Enemies Act case, saying that it was uh, that this was not a declared war. Congress declares war. It was not an invasion and not a predatory incursion. It just went down all the ways that it was inapplicable. Want to go to one of the things that you mentioned, another of those very sweeping opinions by Judge Lamberth, another Reagan appointee. And as you mentioned, this was in defense of Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty. And this is another one of these rulings that happens usually once every couple of years, maybe, where he's taking the historical sweep of history, talking about the 250-year-old republic of ours, and that if liberty and the freedom that we enjoy is going to survive another 250 years, every co-equal branch of government needs to use their powers bravely. Judges don't, these are red blinking alarms by all of these judges from all of these different presidential appointments, from various different jurisdictions, all sounding the same note about the survival of democracy, the survival of the rule of law. They're telling you the same thing, and they're coming from various different backgrounds, or they're and various different presidents. Uh, and they're certainly alarmed. Another thing about his ruling uh, it, regarding Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, it's interesting to note that these were organizations that were meant to get beyond the Iron Curtain, that were meant to get through to authoritarian spaces. And so that was a very important ruling into rescuing these these entities, their funding and their ability to do their important work.
Yeah, so it's talk a little bit about the concept of All Rise News as it relates to having to cover the Department of Justice now. I mean, you and I, going back to the first Trump administration, covered the Department of Justice in the first Trump administration. Then we covered the Department of Justice under President Biden, and now we're back to covering the Department of Justice in this administration. And I want to talk about All Rise News because it's not just breaking down what these rulings mean. It's not just talking about what happened in the courts today. It talks about practical things that people can do to have an impact on the rule of law. And I think that that's exceedingly important because, I have a good trouble segment in my show, and we always, we like to especially like flood these snitch lines and,
Mhm.
and render them inoperable. But to be able to participate as a regular citizen, a non-lawyer, somebody who doesn't work at the Department of Justice in justice,
Right.
I think is so important. And I think that you're one of the only publications that I know of that's doing that. So talk a little bit about the birth of that and how it's working.
Well, thank you so much, Allison. It's basically a conviction that journalism needs to step it up a few notches. I want to respond. I saw a comment there about how the GOP isn't expressing alarm. Another interesting thing about Lambert's ruling is that he calls out the Congress for saying that it's not acting like a co-equal branch of government. It's in control of the power of the purse. It's the one who appropriated the money in a legislation signed by Trump, he made sure to mention. But about All Rise News, and thank you for asking. All Rise News is, as we discussed very recently, a quadruple, quintuple play on words that everyone needs to do their part, essentially. And we look for places where people can use the power afforded to them in a constitutional democracy. Sometimes it's by spotlighting actions that were effective. And related to what we're talking now, we ran a story that featured an interview with a Georgia law student who created a spreadsheet of more than 800 rows listing law firms that were capitulating to Trump or fighting back to Trump. And it was originally started so that students could make informed decisions about who they work for in summer internships or anything like that. And you know what? Students were taking it seriously and they weren't working for the Trump capitulating firms. And it became a recruiting problem with a spreadsheet with data. They made huge impact, and that's at anyone's fingertips. They just did it in an organized fashion with I believe 18 people were directly involved in the creation of that public list that anyone could go to. It's linked to in our story on allrisenews.com. Another thing that we highlight there is a process called notice and comment. When there's a rule on the Federal Register, right now, there's a rule on the Federal Register that will be the next proposed purge of the civil service. That the Trump administration has proposed a rule that would mean replacing up to 50,000 federal civil servants with political appointees that are under Trump's thumb. That is up for notice and comment, which means anyone watching this stream right now can go to the Federal Register and say, you know what? We don't want that. We want civil servants. We want a government that's comprised of professionals, not just the president's uh, chosen, lackeys or apparatchiks. Yes, 50,000. I saw that question there. 50,000 federal employees are on the line in this proposed rule. So we're going to feature notice and comment when everyone can place a comment either anonymously or in their name on the Federal Register expressing their viewpoint on this. We're going to make that a regular feature. We say, what is a proposed rule? What is your ability to comment? And folks, what's the URL? Well, for this particular rule, the rules are generally on regulation.gov, but you can go for this specific rule. It's on an article on allrisenews.com. You'll find it on how the next that Donald Trump hopes that you won't notice the next government purge is the title of that article. So All Rise News in every kind of capacity, the way we're going to approach the story is to try to locate where your power is. And that not treating these stories as, we find out what happens on the next stage of a litigation. This is what happens at the courts. We find actionable information because unlike during a press conference, unlike during a White House press release, uh, the arguments and the facts that are brought forward in those proceedings need to be verified, and lawyers can be held accountable. And if you look at, for example, the kind of bluster of the Trump administration, oh, we don't need to listen to any judges. Well, you should listen to a lot more of the proceedings to see how sincere they are about that, because every proceeding, nearly all of these proceedings that I listen to, the government attorneys are tripping on themselves to try to persuade the judge, oh, yes, Your Honor, we're trying to comply. We interpret the ruling this way. Now, is it a cat and mouse game? You bet. But it's not that. If you want to know about whether these proceedings are working, whether they are having the intended effect, um, that yes, there is very real change that this litigation causes. Is it enough? No. That's why All Rise News is designed the way it is. We're saying that we're not just spectators on the attack on our constitutional order, but at the same time, let's not take a totally fatalistic view of what's going on. There's a lot happening in the courts that really do matter.
Yeah, and that's why we have the Good Trouble segment. Our Good Trouble was to go on the Federal Register and make a comment about that rule and a few others too. So if you need the links to those, they'll be in the show notes for the Daily Beans podcast. But also, I think we got 54,000 non-real complaints at the anti-Christian reporting thing at the Department of Veterans Affairs, for example.
Mm,
I'm suing, MSW Media is suing Doge for Freedom of Information Act requests alongside the First Amendment Coalition with Kel McClanahan and national security counselors. So before I let you go, because we got a couple minutes left here, I wanted to ask you, when you're in court and you're watching these proceedings, you were mentioning, you were getting at this a little bit at the end of what you were saying just a minute ago. I've been in court a few times. But it was during the Biden administration. But I'm hearkening back to, I remember there was a case in the first Trump administration where Donald Trump wanted to add a citizenship question to the census, and it went to court, and the courts came up with a decision, and they all decided, okay, we're not going to be able to put the citizenship question on the census, and everybody thought it was done. And then Donald Trump is like, it's not done. Go back. I'm putting it on there. And the lawyers had to show up in court for the Department of Justice and be like, Your Honor, we are so sorry, because the judge had called like an emergency hearing to be like, excuse me, what's going on? It was like on a weekend. And the Department of Justice lawyers were like, they know. I think as Judge Boasberg said in one of his recent hearings, well, I always tell my staff and my clerks that your trustworthiness is your treasure. Your candor, is of the utmost importance in this court. Kind of given side eye over to the Department of Justice lawyers. And they were like, we're so sorry, Your Honor. We had no idea that this wasn't over. We thought it was over too. Or when the Mueller thing ended, when the Mueller report, the Mueller investigation ended, and a bunch of court dates had to be canceled, the Department of Justice lawyers were like, we're sorry. We when we scheduled this hearing, we didn't think that this was going to be over. We're really sorry. And they were like super apologetic. When you're in these hearings, what is the sense you're getting from the Department of Justice lawyers now? Because I keep thinking like a lot of these folks are left over from the Biden administration. Many are left over from the first Trump administration. Some have been there for 4 or 5 presidents. And back into the Obama administration. What is it like for these DOJ lawyers to put forth these bullshit arguments, knowing, like, I'm especially thinking of the one guy who got fired um, in the I think it was either the Abrego Garcia case.
yes, most.
Eh,
I believe it. I believe it was because he had mentioned uh, that he was the one who let it slip that Abrego Garcia was mistakenly deported, in his words, and not let it slip. He was fulfilling his obligation of candor with the court. It's a good question, Allison. I think that one of the real takeaways are, where are all the line prosecutors? And I'll explain what I mean by that.
oh, it's
It's
because they have Drew Ensign arguing every single case,
exactly,
right?
exactly. What is their reaction? My thoughts are that the main justice lawyers are overextended and doing the work that the line prosecutors do not and will not do. It's to expand on that. I have covered a lot of this. I'm a New Yorker. I've covered the Southern District of New York for a very long time, and usually it's a very fiercely independent jurisdiction, and they don't cede their turf to Washington easily. And all of these big cases, you have high ranking officials from Washington in main justice going up on the Acela, presumably, I don't know how they get here, to argue the cases that New York isn't touching. And all of these big cases, you have the deputy assistant attorney general arguing uh, alone in court. You have Emil Bovey arguing alone in the Eric Adams case. They appear to be jet setting around the country, and I think it's really telling. You have all the political appointees, or the people who work for the political appointees, as close to Washington. doing the work that the line prosecutors would usually do, or the civil division of the respective U.S. Attorney's Office. And it just shows how much Washington is in control of all this, how much the real professionals and career people aren't touching this. And I'll end with this one moment that was recent in the Alien Enemies Act litigation, where one of these lawyers, who was again from Washington, was trying to defend the Alien Enemies Act proclamation and said that it is one of President Trump's most popular policies. And the judge shot back, it's not a popularity contest. This is the department trying to turn this into a White House press release, and that's not how it's supposed to work in court.
Yeah, like I saw somebody on, I think, Abby Phillips' show. I saw a clip where, I don't know, Scott Jennings probably was arguing that, well, most Americans want people to be sent to El Salvador without due process. And, there's people there trying to argue, like, look, but you realize what the Constitution says, right? Again, it's not a popularity contest. I'm sure slavery was very popular in the South in
Right,
pre-Civil War. That's not a legal argument, and so
right.
it's fascinating to see the very gifted line prosecutors being pushed aside for very political and mealy-mouthed Trump allies arguing for the Department of Justice. And I think
Right.
that's one of the things, to bring it back around to where we started with Judge Beryl Howell's opinion. It's one of the things causing these judges to write these rulings for the ages and speak in historical contexts, and to make clear that, as Wilkinson said, the law will sign its epitaph, that history is not going to be kind to this administration and those who defended it looking back.
Absolutely. Very well put, Allison. And to your point, the reason we have a constitution, the reason we have civil rights laws, is because this stuff doesn't go to a referendum. It's not a popularity contest, and that's why we have these constitutional protections. That's why we have a constitution.
Agreed. Thanks to everyone for joining. But I could get addicted to these Substack lives, all the hearts, all the love that keeps effervescing up from from, from everybody that's here. Really appreciate you being here and following the breakdown, my Substack. And if you aren't already following All Rise News, there's so much important information coming out, and not just the kind of coverage that you can get anywhere else. You're also going to get practical things that you can do to help balance the scales of justice and help uphold the Constitution and the rule of law in the United States. So thank you again, and thanks for starting All Rise News. I'm so excited for you and where this goes, and I'm sure we'll have you back, or I'll be over on yours or something sometime.
Excellent. I'm looking forward to it. Have a great weekend.
All right, everyone, have a great weekend. Thanks so much for joining us.